Japan thought Pearl Harbor ended the war. America's 6-month response shocked them. Intro on December the 7th, 1941, the Empire of Japan pulled off a military operation of stunning audacity. In the minds of Tokyo's high command, the attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't the start of a war. It was the decisive, war-ending blow. They believed a spiritually weak and decadent America, now crippled and demoralized, would be forced to the negotiating table. The vast resources of the Pacific would be left to its new masters. It was, without a doubt, a brilliant tactical victory. But it was born from a catastrophic strategic miscalculation. They hadn't ended a war, they had just started one. What they completely failed to grasp was the true nature of the nation they had attacked. They figured America's fleet was its strength, but its real power lay in its factories, its foundries, and the furious resolve of its people. Japan didn't know that in the next 6 months, America wouldn't just recover. It would unleash an industrial and military response so swift and powerful, it would leave Japanese leaders stunned and forever change the course of the Second World War. This is the story of that response, the story of how a sleeping giant, violently awoken, prepared to answer with overwhelming force. The Hook. The chief architect of the attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, might have been the only man in the Japanese high command who truly understood the danger. Having lived in the United States, he'd seen its power firsthand. He warned his superiors, stating that he could run wild for 6 months, but after that, he had no expectation of success. It was a chillingly accurate prediction that would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Japan thought it had struck a fatal blow, but it had missed crucial targets: the naval shipyards, and most importantly, the massive oil storage facilities at Pearl Harbor remained largely untouched. And critically, America's aircraft carriers, the very ships that would define the new age of naval warfare, were out at sea and had escaped the carnage entirely. The Japanese had won a battle, but in their moment of triumph, they had just signed their own death warrant. They had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. Section 1. The Ashes of Defeat. In the immediate aftermath of December 7th, Yamamoto's prediction of running wild seemed to be coming true with terrifying speed. The scene at Pearl Harbor was one of utter devastation. Smoke choked the sky, and the harbor's tranquil waters were slicked with oil and blood. 8 American battleships, the pride of the Pacific Fleet, were sunk or crippled. Over 180 aircraft were smoldering wrecks. The human cost was staggering. 2,403 Americans were killed, with nearly half of them entombed forever in the hull of the USS Arizona. To the Japanese, this was proof of their martial superiority and all the evidence they needed that Americans didn't have the stomach for a long fight. While America reeled, the Japanese Empire expanded relentlessly. It was a blitzkrieg on water. One by one, Allied strongholds fell. Guam was captured. Wake Island, despite a heroic defense by a small group of Marines, was overwhelmed. British Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore, the very symbol of British power in the East, fell in February 1942. The Philippines, an American Commonwealth, was invaded, leading to the largest surrender in U.S. military history. The Japanese war machine seemed unstoppable, seizing the resource-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies and Malaya to secure the oil and rubber their empire desperately needed. By the spring of 1942, the rising sun flag flew over a vast new empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific. To any outside observer, it looked like Japan's gamble had paid off spectacularly. They'd established a formidable defensive perimeter and were ready to consolidate their gains. They fully expected the shocked and wounded United States to sue for a negotiated peace, one that would recognize Japan's new dominance. The problem for Japan was they were reading from a completely different script than the one being written in America. They had mistaken shock for surrender and grief for weakness. They just didn't get the psychology of the nation they had attacked. Section 2. A nation united in fury. Back in the United States, the shock of Pearl Harbor didn't lead to calls for negotiation. It ignited a firestorm of national rage. The political divisions that had paralyzed the country, the bitter arguments between isolationists and interventionists, evaporated overnight. Before the attack, American public opinion was deeply split. A poll taken in the days after, between December 12th and 17th, showed that 97% of Americans now supported a declaration of war against Japan. The debate was over. On December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress and a stunned nation. He didn't speak of defeat or despair. He spoke of righteous anger and inevitable victory. His voice, calm but steely, delivered one of the most powerful speeches in American history. He declared December the 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. He spoke of the unprovoked and dastardly attack and ended with a promise. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. Congress declared war with only one dissenting vote. A few days later, Germany and Italy, honoring their pact with Japan, declared war on the United States. And just like that, America was in a global conflict. Roosevelt's words channeled the mood of the nation perfectly. A surge of patriotism swept the country. Recruiting officers were mobbed. Long lines of young men from all walks of life snaked around city blocks, eager to enlist. The attack had forged a sense of national unity not seen in generations. The slogan, "Remember Pearl Harbor," became a national rallying cry, printed on posters, sung in songs, and scrawled on factory walls. It was a call to arms and a promise of vengeance. Japan's leaders thought they were attacking a soft, divided, materialistic society. They failed to realize they had attacked a nation that, when united, possessed an almost frightening capacity for collective action. The fury was just the beginning. Now, it had to be channeled into the machines of war. Section 3. The Industrial Avalanche. If Pearl Harbor was a single, shattering thunderclap, America's industrial response was a rising earthquake that would shake the Axis to its foundations. Admiral Yamamoto knew Japan couldn't compete with American industry, but even he couldn't have imagined the sheer scale of what was about to happen. On January the 6th, 1942, just 1 month after the attack, President Roosevelt laid out production goals that sounded like pure fantasy. He called for 60,000 aircraft, 45,000 tanks, and 8 million tons of shipping in that year alone. To Japanese and German intelligence, these numbers were laughable, absurd propaganda. They weren't propaganda, they were a statement of intent. The conversion of American industry was something the world had never seen. Civilian production came to a grinding halt. On February 22nd, 1942, the last civilian automobile rolled off the assembly lines. The great auto giants of Detroit, Ford, GM, Chrysler, stopped making cars and began a near-overnight retooling for war. A company that made upholstery nails started manufacturing cartridge clips. The Lionel Toy Train Company started producing compasses for warships. The results were just staggering. General Motors turned its expertise in mass production to building tanks and aircraft engines. Chrysler, which had never built a tank in its life, constructed a new arsenal and ended up producing more tanks than all of Germany combined during the war. But the most iconic symbol of this industrial avalanche was Ford's Willow Run plant. A colossal factory built from scratch, it was designed to apply assembly line techniques to aircraft. By 1944, this one plant was churning out one B-24 Liberator bomber every single hour. And the numbers are mind-boggling. In 1942, American factories produced nearly 48,000 military aircraft, completely dwarfing Japan's output of less than 9,000. The next year, US production soared to over 85,000. Over the course of the war, the United States would produce nearly 300,000 aircraft, while Japan would manage around 76,000 in total. This wasn't just about quantity. America was mass-producing complex four-engine heavy bombers like the B-17 and B-24, a feat the Axis powers could never match at that scale. This industrial might was powered by a mobilized workforce. Millions of women, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, streamed into factories, taking jobs as welders and mechanics. This was the true shock and awe, not a single attack, but a relentless, ever-growing tidal wave of steel, an avalanche of production that Japan's war planners had fatally underestimated. This incredible story of resilience and industrial power is just one chapter in the larger narrative of the Second World War. To make sure you don't miss our upcoming deep dives into the strategies, technologies, and human stories that define this conflict, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us continue to bring this vital history to life. Section 4. The First Jab, the Doolittle Raid. While the factories were roaring to life, America desperately needed a morale boost, a sign it was back in the fight. The news from the Pacific was a relentless drumbeat of defeat, and the nation's spirit was taking a beating. President Roosevelt knew America had to strike back at Japan, not just to do damage, but to send a clear psychological message: you are not invincible. But how? Japanese forces were thousands of miles away, protected by a vast ocean. There were no American bases close enough to launch a conventional bombing raid. The answer was one of the most audacious operations of the entire war, the Doolittle Raid. The plan was radical. Launch 16 land-based B-25 bombers from the deck of an aircraft carrier. These were medium bombers designed for long runways, not the short, pitching deck of a ship at sea. The mission was led by Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle, a renowned daredevil aviator perfectly suited for such a high-risk gamble. The volunteer crews knew it was a one-way mission. After dropping their bombs on Tokyo and other cities, they wouldn't have enough fuel to return. Their only hope was to fly on towards China and try to land in friendly territory. The risks were enormous. The bombers were stripped of everything non-essential to save weight. The crews practiced short takeoffs relentlessly, knowing they'd have less than 500 feet of runway. On April 18th, 1942, the plan went into action. The task force was spotted by a Japanese patrol boat far earlier than planned, forcing the bombers to launch from over 800 miles out. Despite the added danger, Doolittle and his men took off. The appearance of American B-25s over Tokyo caused utter shock. The physical damage of the raid was minimal, a pinprick really. But that was never the point. The psychological impact was immense. For the American public, the news was electrifying. It was a shot of adrenaline, the first good news from the Pacific, and proof that America was hitting back. In Japan, the effect was just as profound, but in the opposite direction. It shattered the myth of the homeland's invulnerability and deeply embarrassed the military leadership, who had promised the emperor that no enemy plane would ever fly over Japan. This loss of face had huge strategic consequences. It pushed a furious Admiral Yamamoto to accelerate his plans for a decisive battle to destroy America's remaining carriers. And that would force him to focus on a tiny, strategically vital atoll in the middle of the Pacific, Midway. The Doolittle raid had successfully baited the hook. Section 5. The Turning of the Tide. The Doolittle raid had poked the hornet's nest. Now, Japan was determined to eliminate the American carrier threat for good. But even before the great showdown at Midway, another battle signaled a change in momentum. In May 1942, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, a Japanese invasion force headed for New Guinea was intercepted by a U.S. carrier task force. This battle was historic, the first naval battle ever fought entirely by aircraft, where the opposing ships never even saw each other. While the U.S. lost the carrier USS Lexington, they stopped the Japanese invasion, the first time a major Japanese advance had been turned back since Pearl Harbor. Just as importantly, the battle damaged a Japanese carrier and wiped out the air groups of 2 others, taking them out of the crucial fight that was just around the corner. Yamamoto's grand plan was now in motion. His objective was Midway Atoll, an island he knew the Americans would be forced to defend. His complex plan involved a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands off Alaska to lure the American fleet north. Then, the main Japanese carrier force, the Kido Butai, would smash Midway and lie in wait to ambush and annihilate the American carriers as they rushed to the rescue. On paper, the Japanese force was vastly superior, with 4 of the veteran carriers that had hit Pearl Harbor. But the Americans had a secret weapon: intelligence. U.S. Navy cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Hawaii had done the impossible. They had partially broken the Japanese naval code, JN 25. They intercepted messages pointing to a major operation targeting a location called AF. To confirm AF was Midway, they had the base send a fake, unencrypted message saying they were low on fresh water. Soon after, they intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF is short on water. The ambush was on. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, now knew exactly where and when the Japanese would strike. Armed with this priceless intelligence, Nimitz set his own trap. He ignored the diversion in the Aleutians and sent his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the miraculously repaired Yorktown, to lie in wait northeast of Midway. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the battle began. The initial Japanese strike hit Midway hard. But as their planes returned to rearm, the Japanese commanders, totally unaware of the American carriers nearby, were caught in a moment of extreme vulnerability. Their flight decks were crowded with planes, fuel lines, and bombs. At that precise moment, American dive bombers, arriving as if by a miracle, plunged out of the sky. In the space of 5 devastating minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were turned into raging infernos. Later that day, American planes found and sank the 4th Hiryu. Conclusion: the giant is awake. In a single day, the heart of the Japanese naval air arm was ripped out. 4 of their finest carriers were at the bottom of the Pacific, and with them went hundreds of their most experienced, irreplaceable pilots. The United States lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, which had fought heroically. The Battle of Midway wasn't just a victory, it was one of the most stunning and decisive blows in the history of naval warfare. It was the perfect reversal of Pearl Harbor. Just 6 months earlier, the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay in smoking ruins. Admiral Yamamoto's prediction that he would run wild for 6 months had come true, but so had the ominous second half of his prophecy. The 6 months were over. The industrial might that Japan's leaders had dismissed as propaganda was now a terrifying reality. The daring of the Doolittle raid had proven no target was safe, and the genius of the codebreakers showed an ingenuity they had failed to anticipate. The victory at Midway was the definitive turning point of the Pacific War. From that moment on, Japan was on the defensive. It lost the strategic initiative and would never get it back. Its ability to replace lost ships and pilots was a drop in the bucket compared to America's ever-growing capabilities. In 1943 alone, as Japan struggled to build just 3 new carriers, the United States was building 22. The scales had tipped irrevocably. The shocking 6-month response, from the ashes of Pearl Harbor to the stunning victory at Midway, proved that Japan hadn't crippled a rival. It had awakened a giant, and that giant was now on the march, filled with a righteous might that would lead through years of brutal fighting all the way to Tokyo Bay. The war was far from over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt.